when you're restoring an old vehicle, like what I'm doing, chances are it's going to be covered in rust, or you'll have bolts that have been oxidized or painted on, things like that, and you're going to want to get them broken loose. So when you're working on a old vehicle with rusted parts, at the very least, what you're going to want more than likely is something like PB Blaster like this, some kind of penetrating oil that will get into the threads of the different pieces of hardware, the different nuts and bolts on the vehicle, that will break loose the rust, and it will help you loosen bolts that you wouldn't normally be able to get off if they were dry. And the longer you soak it with stuff like this, the better. So at the very least, you're going to want some kind of penetrating oil, whether it's PB Blaster or liquid wrench, I don't know. It doesn't really matter, just some kind of good penetrating oil to get that rust out of the way. That also being said, if you've got a problem with water, or you've got a fastener that squeaks, or you just need to lubricate something, obviously something like WD40 or the Blaster all-purpose lubricant would be a good product to have around. You're going to need to lubricate some things, and sometimes things get a little squeaky. This will help alleviate that. And like sometimes a company like Blaster will have a good deal going on where if you buy this, you get this free. So look for a rebate with something like that. And I know that WD-40's got products similar to that, and sometimes they do a rebate. That's what I like about friendly competition. So usually, in most cases, the buyer wins. So at the very least, what you're going to need is something like this to help break loose the fasteners. And obviously, what you're going to want when you're working with fasteners is a good socket wrench. Now, most of the tools I use I either bought at Harbor Freight or cheap on clearance at Lowe's. That's okay, but even if you buy the cheapest tools, you don't have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on Matco or Snap-on or Cornwell tools. You can use the stuff that's at Harbor Freight, but just if you're going to go that way, that's fine. If you're not a tradesman or like a mechanic by trade, you may not necessarily need the really expensive stuff. So I use like stuff like Task Force, Blue Hawk, Cobalt, Craftsman. Sometimes they're professional series. Now, I will say that with certain tools, you're going to want a higher end, better quality tool. But as far as just normal hand tools go, you can get by with the cheaper stuff sometimes. But what I'm going to say with my sockets, if you're working on an older vehicle that's got a lot of rust, you're going to want a socket that's got 6 sides to it. Not like a 12-point socket, sort of like one of my half-inch deep sockets here. That's got 12 teeth on it, and that's one of the more common types of sockets out there. It's going to be the 6 or the 12-point. But if you're working with an older vehicle, you're going to want a 6-point socket, because if you have a fastener that's being stubborn and you've already used something like this and it's still having a hard time coming off, you're going to want a 6-sided socket, because this will ensure a good bite on the fastener, and you're not going to roll any bolt heads or nuts and shear anything off. So you're going to want a 6-sided socket like this, and a good socket wrench. This is a 3/8. I've got a quarter. I've even got a half. But you're going to want a good socket wrench and 6-sided sockets. Another thing is you're going to want a pair of vice grips or pliers like this. These things come in real handy for a number of reasons, and what I've used this for in most cases is putting it on one end of a bolt to keep something still while I'm using a socket wrench, or even an impact in some cases, to keep the bolt still, because you can only do so many things with 2 hands sometimes, let's face it. And you're going to want a good wrench or a good set of vice grips like this to keep different components still. And if you've been watching my videos, you'll notice that I use this to wedge up on a flywheel and grab a hold of a flywheel and keep it still while I was trying to torque down the bolts to the proper torque specifications. So this kept the flywheel from and the engine from turning over while I was trying to do that. So that's one example of using a wrench like this. Going back to sockets, if you are going to use an impact, an air impact or an electric one, you're going to want the right socket for the job, like these black ones here. And I'm not exactly sure what material Cobalt makes theirs with, but when you're using an impact, don't use the chrome plated or the nickel plated silver sockets like this. They're not meant to take the immense torque and the hammering action of an impact. Anytime you're using an impact, you're going to want to use these. And trust me, you will thank me later, because these have a higher tolerance for stress than these do. You're less likely to break one of these on an impact than you would with one of these. So anytime you're using an impact, use these black sockets. And speaking of impacts, depending on what you're doing, I just picked up this Cobalt 350 impact wrench. I think it makes, I want to say it makes like 200, maybe 300 foot-pounds of torque or so. It's not like an industrial impact, but for my applications, it works just fine. It works at 90 psi is the operating pressure on it. You can crank that up to get a little bit more oomph out of it if you want to do that. But with using one of these, with great power comes great responsibility, because I've already sheared off the heads of one or two bolts. I was able to drill them out and get them out. But you want to be real careful with one of these. If you're in doubt, dial it down to the lowest pressure that it'll operate on, and just take it real slow. And if the bolt still won't move, don't try and force it, because you will cause some damage. You could potentially cause damage to your tool, especially if you haven't properly oiled it or lubricated it. But you could cause damage to the fastener as well, if you're not careful. So if in doubt, especially if it's a valuable part, you're going to want to take your time with an impact. And there is times where you're really going to need this, and then there's times where you're just not going to need it at all, and you'll want to use a torque wrench or something that you know exactly the amount of pressure that you're putting on a fastener. So just like any tool out there, it has its golden places, and then it has its places where you could probably use it, but it's not necessarily the right tool for the job. So if you have an impact, it makes the job easier. It's not always necessary that you have one, but when you're taking off bigger fasteners, or like the engine and the transmission off of their mounts, or even changing your tires, you'll definitely want one of these. It makes your life a whole lot easier. I just chose to go the pneumatic way because I've got a good air compressor, but the electric ones work just fine off a 110 power supply. Going back to wrenches, you're going to want something like these Irwin vice grips that I've got here, something like a channel lock plier like this, that you can really bite down on different fasteners and keep things still while you're loosening or tightening with the other tool. And point in case, I used these not long ago with their highest setting here to grab onto a shock absorber while I took the fastener off, because with my impact, it just made the shock absorber spin around and I wasn't really getting anywhere. So these have been a lifesaver. I use these more than just about any tool other than my wrenches in the garage, and they're easy to adjust on the fly to whatever bolt that you're working with, and the grip is pretty comfortable as well. But you're going to want a pair of these, trust me. It's like having a third hand sometimes, and can really hold on to things where other tools, it might be a little finicky to get into different locations on the vehicle. So a good pair of channel locks, you're definitely going to want one of these. If you're working with wiring, or sometimes, like, I cut out all my brake lines, because I'm going to replace all my brake lines with stainless steel and not the original material. I don't know what they used, if it was just normal zinc plated steel, or I'm not sure what they used back in the day, but I'm putting stainless steel brake lines on this vehicle when I get to that point. But I've used these to cut wires, to cut small diameter dowels of metal, or even wood sometimes. I've used them to cut anything from tin cans to aluminum cans to barbed wire. Um, the wiring harness I've been ripping out of the truck, and because I'm not going to use any of the old wiring. On the side note, if you're going to use one of these old vehicles, don't ever mix new and old wiring together. Please don't do that, because I had a friend of mine years ago that thought he could save some money, and he used the old wires and the new wires and mixed parts of the old wiring harness around on a 55 Chevy pickup, second series, and his truck nearly burnt to the ground. And it was on the old 6-volt system. Nothing against the guys who want to use 6-volt systems, but please never mix old and new wires. Get it, just if it's in bad shape, just replace everything. Don't leave any open, exposed wires anywhere. Just be smart with your wiring and replace it all if you have to. So, anyway, but yeah, if you're doing wiring, you're going to want something like this, and you can even, if you're good with it and you can feel around, you can even just pull the jacket off the wire and strip the wire pretty easy. And then you can even get some actual wire cutters and wire strippers like these. These come in real handy. You can even select the gauge wire that you're working with and crimp and cut the wire to the desired size that you're working with. And it's even got a notch for ignition terminals. So if you're doing with wiring, you're going to want a set of these for sure. I think you can pick some up at like Harbor Freight for like $10. They're not that expensive. I know I keep going kind of in random here, but going back to sockets, you're going to want one of these. This is a 1/2 inch by 24 inch breaker bar. I have used this thing a lot. I've used it to break spindle bolts off, and you can really get a good bite with a good breaker bar. This is one I just picked up from Harbor Freight for about $15, but it does have a lifetime warranty, and I believe it says Pittsburgh or something like that on it somewhere. But anyway, it's a Harbor Freight brand. They'll recognize it. It's got a lifetime warranty, so if this thing bends real bad, or if it snaps, or this pin in here breaks, they'll replace it. You could probably get this piece here at Lowe's or another hardware store and fix it yourself. But even if you're buying the cheap tools, get ones with a good warranty on it, because if you break it, in most cases, if the retailer is practicing business from a 21st century standpoint, they're going to, allow you to at least exchange it for a new one or something close to that if they're going to want you to come back in their store. And that's coming from a guy who worked at Lowe's for 4 years in Tool World. So in most cases, if I knew the customer had got it from Lowe's, it didn't matter what store it was. If it was a Cobalt brand tool, I usually let them bring it back in, no questions asked. And it kept them coming back, and I had a lot happier customers that way. So anyway, yeah, you are definitely going to want a breaker bar. And on another note, sometimes I've been able to use a piece of pipe and stretch on this, and like Archimedes said, the longer lever you have, you can undo just about anything. So also, you want to be careful using one of these, because you can shear a bolt head off too. So keep that in mind anytime you're messing with the leverage on a breaker bar. You multiply the strength and its output, so you could end up breaking a bolt if you're not careful. Sometimes you're going to have a hard time getting bolts off, so a good a lever of that, I should say, is a torch. Heat fixes a lot of problems and gets a lot of fasteners undone. When I was trying to get the flywheel off the 235 over there, I found out that it was the wrong flywheel, so I beat on that thing and could not get the fasteners or the guide pins to let go. And so what I did is I applied heat around the guide pins and heated up the flywheel to where it expanded, and then I took a can of air duster, which cooled the pins inside, so that rapid heating and cooling allowed the fastener break loose, and the guy who built the motor spray painted everything, so the paint, I was dealing with not only the rust but as well as the paint, trying to get that flywheel off, and I used a 2x4 and a hammer and beat it like it owed me money, and it finally came off. But heat will help you out of a lot of sticky situations. When you're trying to get an old rusty bolt out, you can heat up the area around it and cause it to expand, or you can even heat up the fastener itself and shrink it down with something like air duster to cool it down. But keep in mind, you can also crack it or even deforge it to a certain point if you do that. So you'll want to be careful when you're using a torch and adding heat and taking away heat really quickly with a fastener. And since they're not that expensive, I think that you can get a new thing of propane for a couple bucks. I think they sell them for like $3 at Lowe's and Home Depot. As inexpensive as they are, go ahead and grab you a couple of these because you never know when you're going to run out of propane, or if you're using MAP Pro gas or oxygen, you're going to want to grab a couple tanks. That way you always have some on hand. Another thing that I use to get fasteners undone and just kind of keep everything tidy. Oh, by the way, you're going to want a flint starter to ignite that torch as well. You can use a lighter, but I think that these are safer to use because you don't have to get your hand like right next to it to start the torch. So yeah, if you're going to get a torch, get it some kind of starter to ignite it. But anyway, back on the subject of getting fasteners undone or just keeping things clean, this truck has grease certs everywhere on it. And so there's a lot of caked on grease and just crusty stuff. This Super Clean, you can get I picked it up at AutoZone. You can get it at a lot of different places, but it's a heavy duty degreaser, so it'll help take some of the grease off of your components on your vehicle. And just clean everything up, because you better believe that all this stuff is going to be nice and clean before I go to the trouble of putting it back together. And another degreaser that you can use out there that I really like is Purple Power. It comes in a white and purple bottle. You can pick it up for about $10 or so. Well worth the investment for sure to get some degreaser. If you're using degreaser or a heavy-duty chemical, you're going to want to keep your hands protected. So I recommend getting some neoprene gloves as well, or latex gloves, or something that's going to protect your skin from chemicals. And these are good to have around. I have these around the shop anyway. I use them to work on the vehicle because I use a lot of haptic feedback from my fingertips. I need to know what I'm doing and I need to feel what I'm doing, but I'm not above getting dirty by any means. I mean, look at my shop. But these really will help keep your hands nice and clean, so if you have to go somewhere in a hurry, you're not covered in grease and getting everything else dirty in your house. So you can use these. They do get sweaty after a while, but they will keep your hands clean while you're working on vehicles. And I used them when I took this differential out, and it really saved me a lot of time and a lot of soap. So you're going to want some gloves like that. When you're working with grinders and heavy-duty tools, you're going to want some mechanics gloves. I really like these because, like I say, it leaves me with some flexibility, but it also protects my hands a little bit when I'm working with different things on the truck. Like I don't know, even right here on my thumb, I smashed my thumb the other day with the hammer because I wasn't wearing these. So depending on what you're doing, sometimes they can get in your way, but a lot of times they can help you. There's different brands out there. I'm not going to say that these are the best. I just like these the best. There's impact-resistant ones. There's ones for the winter time. There's all sorts of mechanic gloves out there, but it's definitely worth the investment if you pick some up because it's going to help protect your hands for sure. Another thing, if you've got the money to do so, I recommend picking up an angle grinder because you can put all sorts of attachments on this thing. Right now I've got this sanding wheel on here because I've been taking off rust and debris off of different pieces of the truck, the different body panels, so I can do some spot welding. So at the very least, you're going to definitely want an angle grinder, and you can put a wire brush on here and really clean up some rusty components where you can make a nice clean weld or a nice repair on it. You're going to definitely want an angle grinder to cut things and to polish things and to clean things up. And I picked this thing up at Harbor Freight. With a heavy-duty power tool like this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting something at Harbor Freight unless you're not going to use it very often, because their tools are on the cheaper side, but a lot of times they will offer 25 or even 50% off coupons depending on what's going on. Like my local store just did a remodel, so they were having a blowout parking lot sale going on, and I was able to pick this thing up for $10. And it's I want to say it's like it's a 6 amp, 120 volt grinder, so it's not got a ton of power, but it's got enough to get the job done, and it's really been handy. I was able to clean up the drive shaft and repaint the drive shaft with that. And so anyway, um, that's as far as tools go. The very basics of the stuff that you're going to want. As far as personal protective equipment, you're going to want some good safety glasses, because trust me, if a sanding wheel breaks or sparks shards of metal, you do not want to get those in your eyes. Please, please, please pick up some kind of like either a face shield or good pair of safety glasses. I've even gone as far as I've got a good pair of goggles like this, depending on what I'm working on. It not only keeps stuff away from my eyes, but it just helps keep my contacts free of debris. I wear contacts, so those really help out a lot. And you're definitely going to want things to keep you safe for sure. So a face mask, safety glasses, and gloves for sure. So I know that I covered a lot, but those are some of the basics of the tools and the different items that you're going to want to have in your garage when you're working on a vehicle as old as mine is. It's got a lot of rusty pieces to it, so just when you're working with these vehicles, just be patient, take it easy, don't wrench on something too hard, because if it's been sitting in the field for 50 years like mine did, you're going to want to take it easy so you don't break something. So there's a few things that you will want to have in your garage. So if you have any other suggestions as to what other things that you have in your garage, I mean, I've got taps and dies and other machining things like that, but as far as the bare basics, I want to know what else you guys have in your shop to get things done, to make things easier. What things you wouldn't necessarily recommend using, and what things you would recommend using for a older vehicle, because like I say, I'm learning as I go as well, and I would appreciate your feedback. So anyway, there's a few tools that you're going to want in your garage when you're working on an old vehicle. So I will catch you guys later.